Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Bob the Bookerer, and today I'm talking about something that's not quite the Booker Prize, but another prize nonetheless, which is the 2020 Women's Prize for Fiction. Now, the Women's Prize and the Booker Prize actually do have a bit of a shared history, and I'll come on to that a little bit more when I do the 1991 Booker Prize shortlist coming at some point in the coming year. The Women's Prize was set up initially because there was an all-male shortlist for the Booker Prize in 1991. And as people very rightly pointed out, this was not okay. You know, there are plenty of women authors creating incredible work, and traditionally their work has long been overlooked and has been sort of sidelined. And so seeing an all-male shortlist for the Booker Prize, and in these days there were those sort of times there were often Booker Prize shortlists with one or two women, so it wasn't like every other year was a bumper crop for women writers being really well respected and acknowledged. And so that's kind of where it was all created. The 2020 Women's Prize, I've been sort of following the Women's Prize a little bit over the last few years, but I've never really sat down and actually tried reading the shortlists themselves. And why not add another reading project to reading all of the Booker Prize shortlists in the last 50 years. I was really excited to read some of them. This was a list that I thought was very exciting and very dynamic. It had a couple of books in there that I'd already been meaning to read, a couple that I'd already read, and some that I hadn't heard of as well. So that was always exciting. And yeah, so let's get on looking at the books themselves. And in 2020, so the 25th year of the Women's Prize existing, we have Maggie O'Farrell as the winner with her wonderful novel Hamnet. So Hamnet is all about William Shakespeare's son, Hamnet, which was believed to then be the inspiration behind him writing the play Hamlet. The reason for that slight name difference is that in those times, Hamlet and Hamnet were used fairly interchangeably, as were Anne and Agnes. We obviously say it more with a hard G now, but Anne and Agnes at the time had a much more similar pronunciation. And so we have his wife all the way through, Agnes, who's sort of portrayed in this kind of magical, powerful way. And I just think this novel is stunning. I really held off reading it for a really long time, partly because I was determined to get it from the library, and then realized I was about sort of 40th in queue and it was never going to happen. And also I just thought, I'd kind of give it a little look in. And I was blown away. I think it's an absolutely stunning novel about the power of resistance and kind of persistence to keep going after loss, about how we transform those feelings of grief and loss into art, in the case of Shakespeare. And it really brings in all of these powerful ideas around magic and the kind of witchiness, which I thought was really powerful and really well done as well. So I was a big fan of this novel, and I think that it will be one of those novels that we speak about for a very, very long time. I think it's a really beautiful one. I think especially what a lot of commentators pulled out, and obviously Maggie O'Farrell herself wouldn't have known this when she was writing it, but it also does cover the time of the Black Plague. And here we are in 2020 reading about theatres shutting because of a plague, and how everybody's sort of scared and forced to stay indoors, and people seeing the smallest signs of illness and being quite concerned and all of those kinds of things. Unnervingly and unknowingly prescient, but a really beautiful novel, and I really think it's worth reading. I think Maggie O'Farrell clearly put a lot of research and time into it, and she puts in the acknowledgements as well that she also took a bit of creative license with the characters. I've sort of mentioned a bit before, I'm not always the biggest fan of historical novels. I can sometimes find them a bit of a struggle, particularly when they are about real life characters, and particularly real life characters as well known as someone like Shakespeare. However, I think what Maggie O'Farrell does that's brilliant is never actually refers to him in the whole book as William Shakespeare. I think once we're maybe told he's called Will, and that's really early on just to establish that we are definitely talking about Shakespeare. But for the rest of it, he is a father, he is a glove salesman, he is an occasional playwright. We're kind of told we don't get that much insight into his theatre world. And I think that's actually really powerful, because that stops him, in my mind, overshadowing the whole narrative. You know he's there, and the kind of ghost of him is there in the novel. But for me, what's so powerful about that is it allows us to really focus on the story of Agnes, and the story of her children. The kind of witchy, magical elements of it are also really interesting, because she gets a kind of premonition at one point of her own death, Agnes this is, and she imagines being surrounded by 2 of her children at her death. And at that time she has 1. Then when she falls pregnant, she thinks, oh, okay, right, here we go, here's my other child. But she has twins, one of whom is Hamnet. And Hamnet switches places with his dying sister in this kind of magical realism kind of moment, and becomes the one who dies instead. It's beautifully, beautifully done. The language just sings and hums, and it's so alive as a novel. There's this incredible scene where Maggie O'Farrell, over the space of about 5 or 10 pages, traces fleas spreading the initial parts of the plague, which doesn't sound like it would be the most exciting narrative, but it's done so well, where you are watching these 5 fleas essentially kind of darting off and jumping onto different people and animals and what have you, and how that spreads. And it didn't necessarily need to be in the novel, but I actually think it was a really great addition. I'm really glad that she put that in. She could have just sort of left it as acknowledged that the plague existed. But I think what's really powerful is this kind of shifting point of view of watching these little fleas dart around, and just, I think as a result, the reminder of how fragile life and civilization and everything like that can be, that we suddenly almost only ever know about this, the fleas and this illness through that, and how these small incidences, she even sort of says it herself, that for these things to happen, 2 people who have never met each other needed to interact in a certain way. And I think that is a really important thing about, if you know, thinking with obviously 2020 and coronavirus, you know, one person, you know, 2 people not knowing each other could spread the disease to many other people, or between each other, or what have you. And that can all happen so seemingly randomly. And I think that's a really powerful thing that she says about kind of how, you know, all of this civilization, all of these sort of things that we've built up around ourselves can so easily fall and be destroyed. And yeah, I mean, I'm rambling about it, but it is a beautiful, beautiful novel, and I really urge everyone to check it out. I totally see why it was the winner of the Women's Prize. It was a strong list, but I think for me, this was a novel that really just cut above the rest, and was a really powerful one. I think it's also worth saying that although there are 2 other novels on this list that I absolutely adore, I think this also made the most sense in terms of Maggie O'Farrell and the Women's Prize more generally. Other people have spoken about, like Lonesome Reader, about how this was kind of the Women's Prize also having their own person they could claim and talk about as their winner, because Hilary Mantel was also on the long list, on the short list as well, as was Bernardine Evaristo's The Girl, Woman, Other, both of which obviously had strong Booker ties, Bernardine Evaristo winning, and at that point people thinking that Hilary Mantel was going to win. So actually I think that also gives a bit of space for a novel like Hamnet to really sing and shine. And so, taking the shortlisted novels alphabetically, next we have Bernardine Evaristo's Girl, Woman, Other. Now, as I just mentioned, obviously this had already won the Booker Prize, and due to the different timings between the sort of submission dates for both the Booker Prize and the Women's Prize, you do often see there being some crossover, not always within the same year. So this is why Bernardine Evaristo can win the 2019 Booker Prize, but be on the 2020 Women's Prize list. Now, I'm really glad to see this novel in the shortlist. I think it's a brilliant novel. I mean, I think a very, very deserving winner of the 2019 Booker Prize. In my opinion, should have won solo, or if it had to share, maybe with Lucy Ellmann's Ducks Newburyport. But I mean, a fantastic, fantastic novel. So at this point, it almost feels strange to give a synopsis of Girl, Woman, Other, because it's so well known and so spoken about. But Girl, Woman, Other is about the stories of 12 people, almost all women, almost all of colour, whose lives intersect in really interesting and varied ways. I mean, this speaks a lot about the roles of racism and sexism in current life, and homophobia. It talks a lot about identity, about roots, about how people treat each other. I just think it's an absolutely stunning, stunning novel. It's interesting, it's referred to as being an experimental novel in some ways, and I guess it is, you know, in terms of its grammatical choices and, you know, not really using full stops or anything like that. Having these 12 interconnecting narratives, all of those kinds of things. But I just think it's sublime as a piece of work. I've now been reading a little bit more of Bernardine Evaristo's back catalogue, which I think many people have sort of been discovering for the first time, which is very exciting, and I think is why, you know, it's so good for prizes like the Women's Prize, like the Booker Prize, to really give a spotlight to some of these authors who people previously might not really have heard of at all. I have to admit, I hadn't heard of Bernardine Evaristo at all until the Booker Prize last year. I think she's an incredible author. I think this book comes together so seamlessly and powerfully. It says a lot about so many topics and issues, particularly around being women or women of colour specifically in the UK. And I just think it says and does so much. I kind of get why perhaps the judges maybe wanted to go for a different winner. You know, Girl, Woman, Other had already had such a high profile after the Booker Prize and went on to be #1 bestseller, which actually, you know, very weirdly is the first time a Black British woman was had the #1 book for fiction, which is kind of terrifying that it took that long for that ever to happen, particularly given so many other amazing Black British writers. But aside from all of that, I think, yeah, it's one of those things. Maybe at this point they kind of thought it's had so much exposure, it's had so much, so many other awards. Maybe it's worth kind of giving the award to somebody else. But yeah, either way, brilliant to see recognition for Girl, Woman, Other. The list maybe almost wouldn't have seemed right without it, seeing as it's been such a monumental novel and it's had such a fantastic year and a bit now. So yeah, I mean, wonderful to see her on there. So next up, and also because I apparently cannot use the alphabet effectively, we have Angie Cruz, who is the first alphabetically, my apologies. Angie Cruz with her novel Dominicana. So this is all about a young woman called Anna who moves to the US with her husband, who we are sort of presented with this kind of quite complicated, layered sort of history of him, but for sort of all intents and purposes, he's abusive. He kind of tries to keep her just within the flat. He purposely doesn't allow her to contact people externally, doesn't allow her to have her own money or really earn her own money that much, at least in a way that she could actually use it. He doesn't allow her to have language classes. And so you've got this really interesting perspective and kind of character who is in America and is in the US without being able to speak English, without really having any link to her home culture and her home country and people. And so she's isolated. She basically lives in this tiny little flat and cannot get out. She falls pregnant, and there is a lot of kind of discussion around what that will mean for her, because obviously that would then mean by US law that the kid is American. And she could then apply for citizenship through the kid. Lots of other things like this, kind of these sort of issues that come up, but we're kind of seeing the world through her eyes, and those eyes are almost all kind of through the window of an apartment, or occasionally when she's able to get outside, and you know, she has English classes through a church and all these kinds of various things. And so we sort of see her blooming into a young woman whilst also acknowledging her freedom and sort of realizing her freedom for the first time. She is sort of trying to get away from this husband, but doing so in a way that won't rouse suspicion, because that will obviously also put her in danger. And so it's this really complicated and this really complicated situation for her to be in. And what I think is really powerful about this is how it details that violence and doesn't necessarily, turn a blind eye to it, doesn't try to hide what that violence looks like, but also doesn't glorify it in my mind, to the extent where we're kind of just watching someone being beaten up. We're seeing it through her perspective, and we are finding ways that she can kind of, finding along with her how she can be liberated in this kind of moment. It also kind of parallels that idea of, the US being the land of the free, and yet there she is trapped inside a house within it. It's a really powerfully done book. I didn't necessarily fully love it or think about it too much afterwards, but I mean, still a very good read. A book that I kind of found myself tearing through, and enjoying, a lot of. So I think this is a really good book to have on this shortlist. I think this shortlist is a really interesting, balanced one, in the sense that you've got such different books sitting alongside each other. And I mean, again, I know I say this often with the Booker Prize, but I don't really know of many other circumstances where you'd find these 6 books sat alongside each other. And I think that's really exciting, to have all of these different narratives and different ways of writing all coming together. Next up, we have Natalie Haynes with 1,000 Ships, which is a novel all about Helen of Troy and kind of an historical retelling of that history of that time. I had never read anything by Natalie Haynes before, and same actually for many authors on this list. This was my first sort of time reading some of their work, and I was really blown away by sort of some of the power of it. I listened to this book as an audiobook, and it's read by Natalie Haynes herself, who, just as a side point, has the best voice for like delivering stories and for telling tales. I was sort of doing a bit more reading about her, and found out that she also sometimes does stand-up, and she does radio, and a lot of that makes sense. She's got that kind of comic timing, not only when she speaks, but in her writing itself. And it's a delight to hear Natalie Haynes talking about her work, and to be reading the work in this case as well. So this, as a result, these kind of feminist retellings, or kind of retellings from the women's perspective of a lot of old myths and tales, they've been quite popular recently. The last few years we've seen a few more of them, like Pat Barker with Silence of the Girls, which was also shortlisted for the Women's Prize last year. And I think it's really interesting to see so many of these narratives being told now, because I think actually for so long these stories were kind of fossilized almost. So kind of, here is the tale, here's how it's always been, here's how it will always be presented. And it's really interesting, I think, to see people turning it on its head and retelling it from a different perspective. And it's been a lot of big name authors who have been really grappling with some of these themes and some of these retellings. So like Neil Gaiman, Stephen Fry, Margaret Atwood. And it's really interesting to see how they adapt some of these tales. I have to admit, I don't know many of the Greek myths and tales myself. This is also a good starting point for me to go back and look into them a little bit more. But it is wonderful to see so many fantastic books coming out like this. I think this is a really great book to kind of sit down and really enjoy. Like I said, Natalie Haynes is very funny and very warm. And so not only do you find yourself loving these characters and loving her descriptions of them, but you do also find yourself just really warming to the narrative style of it all. She is obviously an expert in this field, but also manages to transform those tales into something that feels very current. And one of my issues normally with a lot of Greek tales when I've tried to engage with them is there being so many characters and so many people involved, and I don't really know who all of them are, and I get completely lost about what's happening, and particularly various tribes and various peoples at the time. And I think she does a really good job of just sort of stripping out some of the material and information that's maybe not that useful or important, that might kind of cloud some of the discussions around it, but instead focusing on the real issues, the humans and gods often at the heart of some of these tales. So yeah, I mean, a beautiful, beautiful book. Next up, we have another book that I've kind of already touched on a little bit here, but Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light. So released earlier this year, this was a book that a lot of people had a lot of high expectations of, not only being the third novel in the Wolf Hall trilogy, you know, the first two books of which had already won the Booker Prize. In terms of the Women's Prize, both of them had been shortlisted. You know, this was a trilogy that has sort of brought Hilary Mantel to much more public kind of sort of knowledge. These are sort of some of her best loved works, and it's really interesting to see how people responded to this kind of third novel. Part of the reason that I was actually sort of able to read it earlier in the year was I bought it quite soon after it came out, thinking, right, I'm going to read the first two novels in the Wolf Hall trilogy first, and then finally get round to this, because it's going to be on the Booker list at some point, and I had already resigned myself to reading all of the Booker Prize shortlists. Alas, it didn't make the shortlist, but you know, early into lockdown meant that I suddenly had the time to be able to get through a 900-page book on Thomas Cromwell, which I wouldn't have otherwise thought would have been my thing. I kind of, again, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes struggle with historical novels, and I think Hilary Mantel does such a fantastic job with this book. Wolf Hall I didn't necessarily get on with that much, but Bring Up the Bodies and The Mirror and the Light I just think are sublime. She, on a sentence by sentence level, she is exquisite. She's so clearly in the heads of these characters. She understands the worlds that they live in such a real and visceral way, and it just feels lived in and really it's just so well done. But in some ways I was kind of surprised to see a book like this on the Women's Prize shortlist, because you know, the Booker Prize sometimes has a bit of a reputation for, you know, giving a bit of a leg up to books that are quite dense and maybe less immediately public friendly. As readable as I think this book is, you know, it is a big ask to kind of present a 900-page book to the reading public and kind of be like, ta-da, go for it. You know, people are busy, people don't always have time to sit down and read a book like that and get really into it. Obviously lockdown changed that a little bit. But I think what's so brilliant about this book is that it doesn't bog down the detail of, you know, all of the information and the research she's done goes into creating a world, goes into making the things characters say feel realistic. I mean, I'm assuming it's realistic. I wasn't there, but I think what's so great about it is it creates the world, as opposed to, you know, 200 pages of exposition or information about a character in a various sort of historical event. Kind of looking at you, Moby Dick, pages upon pages about Wales, but what I think is just so great about that is that we kind of know the ending from the beginning, right? This is always the challenge with a lot of historical fiction. We know what's going to happen, but yet she still makes you really reach for the next page to find out more, find out how things are going to happen, find out how it's going to be described. And I think that's the real magic in what Hilary Mantel does here. I loved it. I thought it was really great. You know, it's obviously, you know, everyone was expecting this to win kind of every prize going, especially the Booker, and it didn't make the shortlist. But I still think, I mean, Hilary Mantel has been quite open about sort of saying, you know what, people are going to treat it as a tragedy if this doesn't win everything, but it's fine, I'm fine. And you know what, she is. So I mean, it's a brilliant book. Really happy to see that on the shortlist for this, and it just, I think for me, makes it quite an interesting shortlist as well, because you've got 3 novels all that are set in quite, you know, in history, but quite far back. You know, obviously Greeks, kind of Greek retellings of myths is really quite far back, and then kind of 2 books in Hamnet and In the Mirror and the Light that are kind of focused around sort of 1600s, and so I think it's just really beautiful that the books that have made it on the list that kind of fall into that category are just so well done, and so clearly thought through. And then finally, the last book on the shortlist is just a real spanner in the works. And I think this is really exciting. I love when prizes shortlist novels like Jenny Offill's Weather, which is such an interesting book. It's so short. It's presented in such a different way to sort of, standard novels, in the sense, standard novels will follow sort of paragraphing in a really sort of standard way. This incorporates kind of parts of a questionnaire and parts of various other things, all while kind of musing on topics of environmental collapse, about kind of state of the world, about democracy, about so many other things. And that's what I think makes this novel so interesting and so great. This was a novel, so a few people I know loved it, and a few people I know just kind of didn't really get on with it. I was somewhat in the middle, annoyingly, falling more on the side of really liking it. For me, it didn't fully click, but I also do think that because it's so short, I kind of gulped it down in one go. And it was on a day where I don't think I was particularly in my best reading mode, if that makes sense. And so I do think if I went back and reread it, I would probably adore it. But I love it. Seeing a novel like Weather, which is about 140, 150 pages or something like that, right next to something like The Mirror and the Light at 900 pages. And in some ways, they almost couldn't be more different. You've got like The Mirror and the Light is so, it kind of is concerned around a real experience, a real kind of event, real people, in this historical novel, but is dealt with in this really beautiful, fluid prose. And then you've got something like Weather, which is almost like a kind of scrapbook of a novel, and I mean that in a really positive sense. That it's all these kind of little bits kind of put in, these like little questionnaires, these kind of very short sentences, or kind of sometimes a page where there's hardly any text on it at all. And I love that kind of level of experimentation and kind of creativity. So for me, Weather is one of those books that I think it's just really exciting to see on the list. I know some people really wanted it to win, and I totally get that. For me, I think, again, kind of similar to The Mirror and the Light being quite a tough proposition as a kind of winner, I do sometimes think maybe, a novel like Weather is going to be so divisive because it's so kind of experimental and different. And it's good when prizes do acknowledge that, but I think sometimes you almost want the winning book to be one that kind of straddles a lot of those things, so it can be experimental and really accessible. And so it probably makes a bit of sense to me that something like Hamnet wins. I think that's a book that a lot of people can really get a lot from, but at the same time, I mean, like, it's a great shortlist. This is now making me think that I need to go back and read all of the old shortlists of the Women's Prize, because I need another ridiculous reading challenge in my life right now, seeing as I've still got about 200 Booker Prize shortlisted novels to go, or probably less than that now, but and that's not counting the sort of 13 books that come into it each year, in terms of the long list, plus the International Booker Prize and various other things. So, there's a lot to read. I think that's always the exciting thing about prizes, is it kind of shows you more about what's out there in terms of the books that you could be reading, but that you're not currently. But I have really enjoyed reading my first Women's Prize shortlist, and I really want to go and read more of them in future. Particularly as novels like Half of a Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, that's a novel I adore, and I need to reread. It's been a very long time. Yeah, and it's just so powerful to see some of these fantastic works being celebrated, and from a group. Women writers are often sort of sidelined. Their work is maybe, even if it sells well, it's sometimes seen as less intellectual or less academic or less profound. And so it's really great to see 6 women honoured with this year's shortlist, and the writers who are in the long list as well. But these shortlisted novels really getting more exposure to their work, and work that covers so many different themes. and so many different topics so powerfully. So yeah, that's me having a look at the 2020 shortlist. Really excited that Hamnet won, and glad that I finally got around to reading it. I'd literally read all of the shortlist apart from Hamnet until about a few days ago when I finished Hamnet. So it's well worth reading, and I do really urge you to check those books out and check out more of the kind of shortlists from the past and see if any of the work there sort of tickles your fancy. I've been Bob the Bookerer, talking about the Women's Prize for once, and thank you and enjoy your reading. Bye bye.